All right. All right. So good morning, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Welcome. This webinar is actually part of a three-part series that Rethink is doing this summer, focused on polling and data, and particularly focused on how to use polling and data in your media and communications work to make your work more effective. And we have two more sessions coming up. Next week, we're going to talk about how to actually talk about or communicate about data and numbers, particularly to non-expert audiences. And then the week after that, we're going to be talking about how to actually incorporate polls and data into your media work. What are the actual steps you can take? How does that look in a variety of different situations? Maybe it's a poll that's really helpful to you. Maybe it's a poll that's not so helpful to you. If you have questions during this session, which is about understanding and interpreting polls, please put them in the Q&A so that we don't miss them. There will be a number of opportunities throughout today's presentation where we're going to be asking you to do stuff in the chat. So if you're putting questions in there as well, we might miss them, even though we have some colleagues on the line who are maybe going to watch the chat. It'll still be tough. So please put those in the Q&A so we make sure that we can see them, and we should have an opportunity to address at least a couple of them at the end. So, as I said, today's webinar will focus on how to understand and interpret polls. And I think many of you know me, but not all of you. So I am Eva Galenas Rosenbaum. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm Rethink's Chief Operating Officer and kind of the head of our research work. And I work very closely with Adrienne, who is my wonderful co-presenter today.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Adrienne Lynette, the research manager here at Rethink Media, where I lead a lot of projects on public opinion, of course, as we're talking about today, but also media analyses. And just to run through our basic agenda for today, so you know what to expect. We are first going to be talking about the basic anatomy of a poll. What are the components of a poll? What are some of the important keywords to understand when you're reading through a poll? And that will lead us into how to judge a poll for its accuracy or reliability. We'll also talk about how to interpret a poll's findings. What does it mean? And finally, we'll say a little bit about what we call polling with purpose. So polling for a specific strategic aim, let's say. So onto the anatomy of a poll. So we're going to start with a little nod to the Pew Research Center. I'm sure most of you here have heard of Pew or have relied on their excellent polling work. They have a lot of great information on their website about the practice of polling of public opinion research. So they don't only do polling, they also have a lot of explainers that are really, really useful. This includes explanations of technical terms, of statistical concepts. So we're going to rely on them for a little explanation of sampling that it's a video that they created.
So how can a survey of a small group of people measure public opinion of the entire United States? This idea is called random sampling, where instead of talking to everyone in the population, you talk to a group of people who represent the entire population. Of course, if you want to measure what the entire nation thinks, you can't just stand on a street corner and wave people over. That type of haphazard sample would only represent the people near that street corner at that particular time, and you wouldn't get the people that didn't necessarily want to talk with you. A nationally representative survey requires a random sample in which each person in the United States had a chance of selection. Survey researchers have spent decades perfecting methods to draw a truly random sample that includes all ages, all incomes, all ethnic and racial backgrounds, and all political persuasions. We actually use random sampling all the time in everyday life. For example, when you're making soup, if you stir the pot correctly, you don't have to drink the entire pot of soup to know if it needs more salt. Instead, you can just have a spoonful, because each spoonful tastes like the pot of soup overall. That's random sampling.
Great. All right. Thank you, Pew. So on that note, one of the questions that we get a lot from people about polling is what makes an adequate random sample? So how many people do I need to survey for this poll to be reliable? You'll probably see polls that have a few hundred respondents sometimes, and then others that have thousands. So what is the minimum for a reliable poll? Well, like everything in social science, it's hard to give one answer. It depends, right? But we do have a few guidelines that can hopefully help you make that decision. A poll of 500 people or so is okay. You can't really say anything meaningful about the subgroups, though, with just 500 people. What we mean by subgroups are the specific parts of your sample, different demographic groups, let's say. A poll of 750 gives you enough people to probably compare some big subgroups, like political party or gender, but you won't be able to say much still about the smaller subgroups. Polls with samples of about 1,000 people are the most common these days, and we'd say that's adequate for some robust interpretation. But if you really want to compare smaller subgroups like racial categories, you have to pay close attention to the size of those subgroups. So even in a poll of 1,000 people, if the sample of Black respondents is only 95, let's say, that's not really going to be enough. And, that also applies when we're looking at Native American populations or religious groups like Muslim respondents, Jewish respondents. You really have to keep an eye on those sample sizes in particular if you want to compare. Samples of over 1,000 are really the best in terms of representativeness and crosstabs, so comparing those subgroups to one another. Now, beyond the size of the sample, you should also look at what the sample population actually is. So is this poll sampling all American adults? Or is it just registered voters or likely voters? There are geographical breakdowns. So is this poll sampling just Californians or perhaps just people in the Northeast? Each of these geographic areas has really different characteristics and a different population size. This issue of sampling of the sample population is probably the #1 thing that people overlook when they're reading polls. And what's important to consider here is what does this sample population mean to you? So for example, if you're looking to predict the outcome of an election, then it makes sense to poll likely voters, right? If you're interested in persuading lawmakers with the results of your poll, then registered voters are probably the people that they're going to care most about. And if you're trying to bring new voters into the system, then you'll want to sample all adults, not just those likely voters or registered voters, because you want to capture everyone who's a potential voter in that case. Now, because samples are usually not a perfect representation of our population, pollsters use something called weighting to adjust their samples. And we're again going to lean on Pew to explain weighting. It's a continuation of that same video.
Once you have your random sample, how can you ensure that it actually represents the overall population? A sample could differ from the overall population because some people are more likely than others to take surveys. So pollsters use a standard technique called weighting to adjust for differences. We know the demographic composition of the United States thanks to data from the US Census Bureau. So once we have our sample, we compare the respondents' demographics to the makeup of the whole country. We look at things like age, gender, education, race, and region. Weighting allows us to adjust our survey data so that it matches the general population on these characteristics.
So just like sampling, weighting is also as much an art as it is a science. For one, the census is just one way to weight. And of course, the census is not perfect, and nor is any other account of the population for that matter. So that's something to keep in mind. And what if your sample isn't of American adults, but of likely voters? In the case that I just described, where you're really wanting to capture those likely voters, what are their opinions? How do you decide which voters are likely to vote? Different pollsters may have different methods for arriving at that label. Now, the choices a pollster makes about how to weight a sample can really affect the results. The New York Times's opinion polling section called the Upshot, they demonstrated this nicely in the 2016 election. So during this time, they gave 4 good pollsters with good reputations. They gave them all the same raw data on presidential election polling and allowed them to weight the sample as they saw fit. And they got back 4 different results, plus a 5th result that was from the Upshot's own work with Siena College. Now, there's not much that you can do about weighting. Every pollster does it because, as I mentioned, sampling is just not perfect. But it's not really realistic for each of us to dig into the technical details of each pollster's weighting as we're looking through all these polls. That's even if they would let us do that. Sometimes pollsters don't make their weighting or other aspects of their methodology public. So with that in mind, just remember a couple of important points about weighting. So one is that weighting will be a bigger factor and will have a greater effect on the findings when you're trying to get your sample to resemble an unknown population, such as likely voters, than when you're matching a known population like American adults, because there's just going to be a lot more guessing involved. The second thing is that weighting will be a bigger factor when the samples of certain people are much smaller in the survey than how they are in the total population. So we see this sometimes with certain racial categories or religious groups that in the survey, they're just underrepresented. And we're going to come back to this in a little bit. But first, I want to turn to one other important element of polling methodology, which is called the mode. This is just the medium through which the data is collected. How do they get those survey answers? So polls all used to be conducted by telephone. And until about 10, maybe 15 years ago, any other type of polling wasn't considered reliable or methodologically sound. Telephone polls are done by what's called probability sampling. Every phone number in the US has the same chance of being called in this method. This is just like how the Pew video described with the spoon in the soup, right? As Americans have moved away from landlines, though, pollsters have really added cell phone samples. They've really started to lean on that to make sure they're still reaching a reflective sample of the population. And some pollsters will use a combination of different modes. So in the chat, if you could just take a moment to think about what you think some of the potential drawbacks of telephone sampling might be. That could be landline telephone sampling or cell phone sampling. any ideas of some challenges that might arise? Yes, so I'm seeing a couple people already that that note that people don't like to pick up the phone anymore. This is very true. I know I'm guilty of that. Yeah, particularly you might notice the pollster might notice that there are certain populations that are picking up their phones more than others, right? I see somebody said that younger people maybe don't pick up their phone as much, which would result in overrepresentation of older people in the survey, right?
Oh, this is a great comment that people keep their phone numbers from zip codes they no longer live in. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah,
That's
that's a
also
great
very
example.
true.
I have a number that is not at all related to where I live. Yeah.
Yes, and I've seen a couple people wondering about honesty. So that's another
Mhm.
important aspect of this is that there is research to suggest that people will answer questions differently based on the mode. So if you're talking to a live person, you might get, you might get different results as opposed to if you send out an online survey or something like that.
Yeah.
Yes. So in the last decade, it's become a lot more common to conduct polls online. And this image here is, I know it's a little bit hard to read, but it's just a screenshot from a YouGov poll. And YouGov, which we're going to come back to, they do a lot of polling online, as do all of the other major pollsters, really. Morning Consult, NBC News, lots of companies use online polling, or sometimes, as I mentioned, a combination of online and telephone polling. So one thing to note about online polling is that it usually makes use of what are called opt-in panels. And those panels are contain non-probability samples. So basically that means they're creating pools of potential respondents to be in these panels, and they're sort of on call. And then they're asked to fill out surveys periodically in exchange for something. So they're getting some sort of incentive to respond to these surveys. Sometimes it's points that they can redeem for some sort of prize. Sometimes it's a charitable donation. Sometimes it's in order to access some content online. But it's just, a way to incentivize people to respond to these surveys. There are also potential drawbacks to internet panels, just like there are drawbacks to telephone surveys. So for one, as I just mentioned, these are not random samples. So pollsters have to rely more on weighting in order to arrive at a representative sample. Also, if you're not talking to a live person, there's nobody there to clarify answers or to ask follow-up questions. And, just like a lot of you noted with the telephone polling, not all types of people are equally likely to be in these opt-in panels or even to be reachable by internet. So you may be missing out on important segments of the population this way. And now Eva is going to bring us back to the idea of sampling, specifically the impact of sample size on a poll's accuracy.
Yes, indeed. So polls are a way of estimating how many people fall into a certain category or think a certain thing. As we've been discussing already, and as I think they're far from foolproof, and each poll has a different level of accuracy. One of the ways that we estimate that accuracy is through something called the margin of error. The margin of error basically is a way of expressing how accurate or generally inaccurate a poll might be. So as Adrienne was just saying, we've talked about sample size, and the sample size has a direct effect on the margin of error. The larger the sample, the smaller the margin of error. That's what this is showing you right now. So When we see a margin of error, it's usually expressed as plus or minus some percentage points. So it's pretty typical to see something like plus or minus 2.3 or plus or minus 4.8, something like that. And what it's doing is it's describing how likely the sample is to be an accurate representation or an accurate reflection of the population, whatever that population is that the poll is actually polling. So it's telling you that each result, each percentage in that poll is in the range above or below that actual number that it's reporting. And we're going to talk about that in greater detail right now, because margin of error, I think, is probably the thing that we get asked about the most when people don't really understand a poll. So we're going to look at a quick example. Let's say we have a poll of registered voters, and we have a sample of 1,000, which, as you heard Adrian say earlier, is pretty typical. That's probably the most common sample. Now, for a sample of 1,000 people, the margin of error, based on that curve that you just saw, is plus or minus 3.4 points. So in this case, what we're asking in this poll is how many people plan to vote in the election and how many don't. And the result of the poll is really just an estimate of the actual number of people who are, in this case, planning to vote in the election or not. To understand where the actual number is likely to be, that is, what range is it in, we measure 3.4 points up from the estimate from the poll and 3.4 points down from it. So in this case, if 45% of the people in our poll say that they're going to vote, the margin of error tells us that with pretty reasonable confidence, the real number is somewhere between 41.6% and 48.4%. They're in this range. And that range is what we call the confidence interval. This is not a term you need to memorize or anything like that, but just so you know, that's what it's called in statistics. And that's the range in which the real number of people planning to vote in this election most likely falls. It's somewhere in that range. In other words, the real number of people planning to vote in the election is very likely between 41.6 and 48.4%. Most of the time, though, we're not looking at a single poll number in isolation. What we're actually doing is comparing two or more components of a question. So in this case, we might want to ask, are more people planning to participate in this election, or are more people planning to sit out the election? Now, at first, this really seems pretty obvious. The poll tells us 45% are planning to vote, 55% are planning not to vote. So it seems obvious. But remember that these are just estimates of the real number. And the real number for each one falls somewhere in the confidence interval for that result. So we actually have to compare the two confidence intervals to each other. Now here we see that there's space between the two confidence intervals where we've measured with that margin of error 3.4 points up and 3.4 points down from each result. Because there's space, this is telling us that the range of probable values for people planning to vote does not include the range of probable values for people not planning to vote. So we can be pretty confident that more people are planning not to vote than are planning to vote. But what if the results were just a little bit closer? What if 48% of people in our sample said that they plan to vote and 52% said they don't? In this example, even though the results have barely changed, they've only changed by a couple of points, now the confidence intervals actually overlap with one another. And this tells us that the range of probable values for people planning to vote includes some of the range of probable values of people not planning to vote. So in other words, the actual number of people planning to vote and not planning to vote might both be in that overlap area, this center area. So we can't be statistically confident that more people are planning to not vote in this election. Now, margin of error is also higher for subsets of the sample than for the whole sample. And that's because subsets are, obviously smaller samples of the overall bigger sample. This is really important to keep in mind when you're trying to compare groups within a poll. And it's actually a pretty high bar to clear in order to see a statistically significant difference. So one way to think about it is that the smaller the subset, the further away from the others or from the average it has to be statistically distinguishable from the others. So again, an example, let's say that within our sample, 400 people are Democrats and 300 are Republicans. And let's say that 70% of Democrats say that they're planning to vote, while only 60% of Republicans say that they are. Now, it seems pretty obvious, again, that Democrats are more enthusiastic about this election than Republicans, but not so fast. We have to do the same thing here that we did before. We have to compare the two confidence intervals. Now here, because the margin of error for a sample of 400 is plus or minus 5.4, and the margin of error for a sample of 300 is plus or minus 6.2, these are very large margins of error, we have really wide confidence intervals. So even though the two estimates, that is 60% and 70%, are 10 points apart, which seems like a really big difference, there's actually still an overlap. So we can't be statistically confident that they're different, although it is pretty likely because that's a very small overlap. Now, before I hand it back to Adrian, I just want to note that, as Pew Research Center puts it, non-probability sampling, which is what we use for online polls, doesn't permit the computation of a margin of sampling error the same way that probability sampling does. So there's greater uncertainty about the accuracy of results from these samples, but they have some advantages over probability samples. And we've just talked, we saw in the chat, all of the reasons why those probability samples might not actually be very accurate. So on balance, we still think that the non-probability samples that we get from online polling, if they're done well, are still pretty accurate. When you look at a poll that's done online, you will see something that's similar to a margin of error, but it's not statistically exactly the same thing, but it's still an estimate of the error of how accurate the poll is.
Okay. So we have talked a lot about political polls, but of course, polls can be conducted on lighter topics too. YouGov recently did a poll asking Americans for their views on various insects. So right now, I just want everyone to take a second and consider what you think the most popular bug was in this poll. And if you're so inclined, see if you can also guess what they said their least favorite bug is. And I'll reveal the results in just a moment. Okay, Mac, I don't know if that's like a aspirational cicada vote. Least favorite cockroach.
Least favorite spider, possibly. Yeah, I'm seeing
Sure.
a few votes for that.
Butterfly best, mosquitoes worst, butterfly, ladybug. All right.
All right, shall we reveal it?
Let's reveal it.
All right.
So probably not terribly surprising, by a pretty wide margin, butterflies are the #1 insect, according to this poll. Perhaps also unsurprisingly, mosquitoes are the least liked, although cockroaches are very close. Now, a poll about insects is probably not going to be terribly consequential, except maybe for the bug spray lobby, I don't know. But as this election season ramps up, we are going to be seeing a lot more polls that do have the ability to sway attitudes and influence strategy, and maybe even outcomes in really important ways. So with that in mind, I want to say a bit about some of the best and worst practices in polling so you know what to look out for. First, let's talk about question wording. How you ask a question in a poll can make a big difference. Now, this seems intuitive probably when I say it, but it's something that we don't always think about. We don't always think to look at the question wording. because pollsters are professionals, right? They're supposed to know how to do this. And that's true, but they're also human, just like the rest of us. Even when they're trying to do a good job, everybody has biases, and they may not be aware that they're asking a bad question or that they're implying something that they didn't intend to imply. Of course, that's giving them the benefit of the doubt. The darker side is that sometimes pollsters are trying to get a certain answer or trying to skew the question toward one side or another. This cartoon here, it depicts the worst version of question wording, which is referred to as a push poll, essentially trying to push people toward a certain response. Most polls aren't like this, obviously, but as polling becomes cheaper and more accessible, we have been seeing more of it. So for example, here is a poll that the Trump campaign sent out toward the end of 2017. So I know the type is a little bit small, but if you can, take a moment to read through the questions and the responses. And then if you could let us know in the chat whether you see any issues with this poll. Yeah, it's like comically bad.
Yeah.
Obviously, so for the first question about Trump, they gave 3 positive options, right? And 1 neutral. Then for the second question, which is supposed to be mirroring it about Obama, they gave those, but also with a poor option. So that's already really messed up. And then, of course, the last question, they really primed respondents with a reference to the fake news media, right? This was a poll that was sent out by the Trump team and was likely meant more to kind of gin up support rather than to find any meaningful data. But for nonpartisan pollsters, the big ones like Pew and Gallup and YouGov, also some news organizations, we can usually err on the side of assuming they don't intend a biased question unless they prove otherwise. And some partisan pollsters are also quite reliable. I'll say a bit more about how to find out which pollsters are reputable in just a minute. So since different pollsters use slightly different methodology for sampling, for weighting, for the mode that they use to get their responses, the best way to assess public opinion on a given question is to look at several polls conducted with different samples, different question wordings, different weighting techniques, and then to average those. So in other words, some polls are better than one poll. And that is a general principle that we use at Rethink when we are analyzing public opinion. This image from 538's website shows an aggregation of recent polling on Donald Trump's favorability ratings over time. So most of the polls indicate that his favorability rating, which is the one in the purple, lands somewhere between 35% and 45%. There are some outliers that you can see, but there's enough polling here to be able to calculate an average that we can be pretty confident about. And they helpfully illustrate that average with the bold line running through all of that data. And as I mentioned, there are ways to find out whether a poll is trustworthy or not. You can ask us at Rethink, or you can rely on, again, going back to 538, they have a running list of the major pollsters, and they give them all ratings according to their accuracy, their bias. So if you come across a poll and you want to check whether that pollster is reliable, we recommend that you look for them here. And I'll also note that 538 has a segment on their politics podcast, if anybody listens to that they call Good or Bad Use of Polling, where they talk about some of the recent polls or a big recent poll, and they discuss a lot of that poll's components. And then they talk about whether it's trustworthy or not. So if you're interested in polling, in methodology, in all of that, it's a great way to hear some very smart people talk about polling in a way that's accessible and that's pretty entertaining, and often really relevant to our work.
All right. We've talked about the pieces of a poll, the anatomy, and we've talked about recognizing good ones versus bad ones. So now we actually have to interpret the poll. We have to read what it's telling us and like make some meaning out of that. So how do we do that? When we first look at polling results, we should be asking questions, and they're often very simple. They're like, how much support is there for this policy? Or how much do people trust the Supreme Court or the media? Or how many people are going to vote or intending to vote? Now, the poll can give us that answer, pretty much right away, although with the caveats that it might be more or less trustworthy, as we've already talked about. But interpreting the answer is actually more about explaining it. So we want to know, why do some people support this policy? Why do people trust the Supreme Court or the media or not trust it? Why are some people going to vote or going to sit out this election? Another way of putting it is, what explains the difference? And that could be the difference between what two groups of people think, or maybe the difference between what two individuals actually do. So let's talk about an example that will be probably familiar to you: whether someone is going to turn out to vote. Now, why do people vote? This is probably the fundamental question in political science. There is no definitive answer. Instead, there are a lot of what we call explanatory variables. There are different kinds of things that contribute a little or a lot to the behavior that we're trying to explain, which is whether someone votes or not. Now, if we're trying to explain this likelihood, we might ask some questions like, did they vote before? Are they registered to vote? Do they belong to a political party? Now, in the chat, I'm going to give you just like half a minute. What are some of the other things that you would want to know about someone if you were trying to figure out or predict whether they're going to vote or not? Age, yep. How old they are, yep. Their location, where are they? Their race, What are some other things you might want to know about somebody to predict whether they're going to vote? Did their parents vote? Excellent. Yes. Do they get time off from work to vote? Great. How close is their polling station? Excellent. Yeah, these are all fantastic. And there are a lot of them. Yeah, how much did they earn? A couple of other things you might want to know. What's on the ballot? What are they actually going to be voting on? How long is the ballot? I vote in California, specifically in San Francisco County, and my ballot is almost always 3 to 4 pages long, front and back. It's very long. Other places, they have a very short ballot. They don't vote on very much, and that can be a barrier if it's too long because it's too many things. Do they get time off to vote? I saw that in the chat. Do they know anyone else who votes? Do they have a plan for voting? So lots and lots of things that you might want to know that all have some effect on whether someone turns out. Now, one of the things that I just talked about is partisanship. And partisanship is the most important explanatory variable, I would say, or certainly one of the most, in American political and social attitudes. Now, what you're seeing, this animation, is showing how partisan attitudes have become more and more distinct over a period of a couple of decades. I looked for a more recent version of this, updated since 2017, couldn't find one, but it's so good that I decided to use this anyway. And, I think we kind of instinctively understand, but that these attitudes have been getting farther apart, but we don't usually see it depicted quite like this. Partisanship works in a kind of feedback loop because people choose a party because it generally aligns with their political leanings, or maybe their parents or their friends were part of that party. But people also receive information from the party about how to think about things, which we call partisan signals. And these signals are really crucial because most people don't have a lot of information about politics, and they don't actually want a lot of information about politics. They're not trying to think about politics all the time. They have other things on their mind, and that's not important to them. But when they're asked to state a preference or vote on something, they have to fall back on some information, and they don't have a lot of it. So what they fall back on very often is partisan signals to tell them how to think about or how to vote on something. Basically, it's a shortcut that people use. And since the parties have gotten more distinct, that is, they've gotten further apart from each other in the last couple of decades, partisan signals are now much more powerful. Now, if we focus on 2017, which is the last year for which I have this wonderful graphic, the polarization picture actually gets even more intense because this is the general public and this is politically engaged Americans. So it's really, really stark. Okay, most of you have probably heard the phrase correlation is not causation. Maybe this is from school. Maybe you remember someone else saying this to you at one point. Maybe you've had a conversation with me and I've said this to you. The distinction between correlation, which is two things that are changing somewhat predictably in relation to one another, and causation, that is something causing another thing to happen, is really important when we're interpreting polls. Now, to illustrate this difference, we're going to use an example that probably is not related to your work, which is breakfast. Specifically, we're going to talk about the relationship between breakfast and elementary school performance. Now, let's say we have many studies that are telling us that elementary school students who eat breakfast do better in school, as measured by their GPA. This is just one metric, of course. The immediate question is, why? Why is this true? Or we think about a couple of slides ago, what explains the difference between kids who do eat breakfast and don't in a way that also explains academic achievement? Now, if we were to think of breakfast as having a causal effect on academic performance, we could come up with a couple of ideas, right? Hunger is distracting. So if you don't eat breakfast, that causes you to do worse in school because you're hungry, and that's distracting you from your schoolwork. Or breakfast feeds the brain, kind of another version of that. However, it's much more likely that breakfast has a correlating relationship with academic performance. It's not necessarily that eating breakfast is the reason that you get higher grades, but that eating breakfast has a relationship with the causes of higher or lower academic achievement, and it changes in a predictable way alongside GPA. For example, we might hypothesize that kids who don't eat breakfast are more likely to be tardy or absent, which can result in lower academic achievement because they're missing school. Or we might hypothesize that kids who don't eat breakfast may be less likely to get study support at home, which can result in lower academic achievement because that's where concepts are really cemented at home, and they kind of get more understanding. Okay, that's breakfast. Let's look at an example that's more relevant to our work. And actually, this came up in the chat when someone suggested that race is one of the things that you might want to know if you're predicting whether someone is going to turn out to vote or not. This chart, again, I tried to find a more recent version and couldn't. This shows that although turnout rates vary from election to election, the rates of voting by most large racial groups in the US are lower than those of white people in the US. Now, we're not going to get into exactly why that might be here. But what we can say is that race correlates with turnout, right? That is, your racial identity has a somewhat predictable relationship with your likelihood of voting. And you can see that very clearly in the way that these lines are drawn. But race doesn't have a causal relationship with voting. In other words, there's nothing inherent about being white that makes you more able to vote or more interested in elections. That said, many factors associated with race may be causal. For example, systemic racism creates barriers to civic participation for some people and not for others, or creates bigger barriers for some people and not for others. So that is a correlation relationship, not a causation relationship. And those are really important to think about when you're interpreting polls. Crosstabs, which Adrienne mentioned earlier, are all about correlation. Now, crosstabs are telling us about the correlation between various demographic characteristics. So they might be age, religion, region, race, gender, partisan affiliation, any of those things. And the correlation between those things and holding certain views and opinions about like a political issue or about your favorite insect. So looking at crosstabs can be really important, particularly in communications, because it tells us which audiences we want or need to focus on. And it gives us key information about how we might approach a campaign differently for some audiences versus others. This is an example of how crosstabs are usually reported by pollsters. So here we see the question at the top. In this case, this is about how important preserving democracy is in voters' choice for president. And at the left, you see the total results, which we usually refer to as the top lines. And in this case, it's that preserving democracy is extremely important to 51% of registered voters, very important to 31%, somewhat important to 12%, et cetera. Next to the top lines are the crosstabs, in this case for party identification, which we usually call party ID. And this is where things start to get interesting because it reveals that while half of all registered voters say that this is extremely important to their choice of president, there's actually a pretty big split between Republicans and Democrats. And then the independents are falling somewhere in the middle, which is pretty typical. All the way on the right, in this case, we see the crosstabs for white registered voters who have or do not have a four-year college degree. And you'll often hear this shorthanded as college and non-college whites, just when we're speaking about polling results. Now, this also reveals an interesting split with more highly educated white voters placing a greater emphasis on preserving democracy in their choice of president. Both of these crosstabs can give us hints about which audiences will be most receptive to our messages. And they can also tell us something about partisan signaling and the correlations between education and partisanship. This is one more example of crosstabs, this one from YouGov, which we've shouted out a couple of times. That's partly because they are probably the gold standard at making their data really available and transparent. And they have fantastic crosstabs for basically all their polls. So I strongly encourage you to check them out. This is a very typical version, and this is from a very recent poll asking whether respondents personally hope the US elects a woman president in their lifetime. Now, sometimes crosstabs really surprise us, pleasantly or otherwise. So here, maybe not too surprising, we see that women are 10 points more likely than men to say, yes, they hope we elect a woman president within their lifetime. Not too surprising, maybe a little disappointing. However, what I found really startling is this crosstab here, which looks at the breakdown between voters who intend to vote for Harris versus those who intend to vote for Trump. And in case you can't read this, I know it's smaller on some people's screens. Amongst Harris voters, 95% said that they would like to see a woman elected president in their lifetime. Not hugely surprising, they are supporting a female candidate for president. But only 18% of Trump voters said the same thing. That's where I was a little surprised and very disappointed, although not, I would say, shocked. One thing to note here is that the total numbers at the bottom here are smaller than in the other categories. And that's because not everyone has made up their mind yet about who they're voting for. So here in these crosstabs, they're only including respondents who stated an intention to vote for one candidate or the other somewhere in the survey. And it's really important to pay attention to those numbers because they can tell you how far apart the results actually have to be in order to be confident that they're statistically significant, thinking back to that margin of error and the confidence intervals. So pay attention to these, what we call the unweighted N, the number of people who are in each of those categories. All right. In our last couple of minutes, I'm just going to talk very briefly about polling with purpose. Now, most of the polls we've used as examples today are publicly available. They're often conducted by or on behalf of news organizations or research entities like Pew, Gallup, YouGov, et cetera, people that you're familiar with. These polls generally have one of two purposes in mind. They're either for kind of general understanding of public opinion on important issues, which is typically what Pew is after, or they're trying to drive news coverage, which is usually the goal for outlets, news outlets like New York Times or Fox News. However, there are other reasons to conduct polling research, as I'm sure you know. Whether you're considering doing some research yourself, or you're simply consuming research from other people, it's always a really good idea to ask, why is this research being done? What is the goal? In addition to, general understanding or driving news coverage, a poll might be fielded to test messages or messengers, or it might be tested to identify potential audiences for a campaign, or to gauge appetite for a policy. Or, of course, it might be fielded to try to predict the outcome of an election. And there might be other reasons as well. So the purpose of the poll influences what questions are asked and how they're asked. The word choice, the order, something that Adrian was talking about earlier. The most successful research really has one goal rather than multiple goals. And if you are going to commission a poll, consider the primary outcome that you're trying to achieve with the research. Are you hoping to create news around your findings? Are you hoping to make a decision about a campaign? Are you hoping to find the most persuasive message for your target audience? No matter what your goal is, we strongly encourage you to plan your rollout strategy before the poll actually goes into the field, because the outcome you're hoping to achieve really should inform the survey design itself. Luckily, Rethink can help with this. Now, we do have an in-house research team. You are hearing from us today and in the subsequent couple of webinars in this series. We do in-house polling research. We also do message testing. We do media analysis, needs assessments. But even if you don't want us to conduct the poll or the research that you're doing, we also frequently advise partners on crafting better research, particularly when it comes to the end game, that is the rollout, the communications plan, what's going to come next. So we're always happy to talk about that. And we love talking about research. And our main goal is to make sure that research is the most effective it can possibly be for the field. So on that note, we might have time for one or two questions. And while you are maybe entering a question or two in the Q&A, I'll just plug the next two sessions in this webinar series. So a week from today, we're going to be talking about how to actually communicate about data and numbers to non-expert audiences. And then the following week, we're going to be talking about how to use polls in your media and communications work to make it better, stronger, more effective, more persuasive. So let's see if we have questions that we need to answer here. Not seeing a ton, which is great. All right. Give it one more minute to see if anyone has questions we want to answer. And you can always follow up with us if you have a question that you want us to answer offline, or you think of something later. Please feel free to get in touch with us through the email that's on the screen right now.
I do see a question from Nancy. How are questions tested before putting them in a poll? This is a really good question. And I'll start by saying that it depends on the pollster, but oftentimes pollsters will rely on previous polling to kind of be able to tell whether certain question wording is going to be successful or not. And that also allows a pollster to track opinion over time if you ask kind of the same question or a very similar question. So that's one strategy. Also, oftentimes pollsters especially if they're polling on behalf of, say, an advocacy organization, will maybe do a bit of message testing before a poll goes out into the field. So this is also kind of like a poll. You're still asking the general public questions. But in the case of message testing, you're really trying to understand, how do people perceive certain terms or certain keywords? How do they respond to certain arguments? And doing that kind of message testing can really help you refine the questions that you might ask in a subsequent broader opinion poll. And then a third thing that I'll say is that often research firms will rely on focus groups before they commission a poll. That would be just convening, a few people to kind of have a conversation about the topic to help them better understand what regular people are thinking about it, what they're hearing about it, and that can really help inform question wording as well. Do you have anything to add to that, Eva?
No, I think that was a great answer. And it really does depend. One other question I'm seeing here, just as we wrap up, is your advice free? And I know this is going to be a really dissatisfying answer, but it depends. But in general, we're very happy to consult, kind of do some light consulting, have a quick call with someone, et cetera, really for no additional charge, particularly if your organization is part of one of the movements that we already support. If it gets a little more complicated or in depth, or we're doing a bit more work, looking at the survey instrument, helping you craft questions, then there might be a nominal fee for that. And then it can go up from there. So it kind of depends, but we're always very happy to have an initial call and just kind of scope out what you're thinking of. So we are right at the top of the hour. I know many of you will have other commitments that you need to get to. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. We really hope you sign up for the next couple. They're going to be excellent and I think quite interesting. When we've done them in the past, they've been super popular. So we hope that you'll come back in the next couple weeks. Thank you very much for joining us today. And you will get an email from us, which includes a short evaluation survey. We would really love for you to take that. It's very, very helpful to us. You'll get that in the next day or two. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.